Hi friends, welcome back to the Daily Bible Project podcast. And we're in the beginning of this new section of scripture, looking at Genesis chapter 20, continuing the narrative story of Abraham and his various adventures, shall we call them. But either way, it's great to have you with me today, and I hope we're really going to learn something helpful from this next chapter of Genesis. And I've entitled today's short introductory talk to this chapter, When Things Go Wrong. But let me just remind you that if you find these teachings helpful, then a full transcript of each and every episode is available in the episode notes section of any audio version of this podcast. Now, if you happen to be listening or watching rather on Facebook or YouTube, you should be able to click through and find a link to the Buzzsprout website to host the audio podcast, and you'll find the transcript in the episode notes page there. But we're going to talk today about the situation with Abraham, and hopefully we can learn from it, because I've titled today's opening introduction to chapter 20, When Things Keep Going Wrong. Maybe that resonates in your life. A few years ago, when I was preaching in a church, someone took me aside after the service and they asked me if they could talk with me alone. Now, that's quite a common occurrence, I'm sure. If you're a preacher or a Bible teacher, you'll know that. I suspected that this was something serious and personal, so we both went aside to a private side room, and it was in there we began to talk. I soon discovered that what they really wanted to tell me was about this very specific sin they had committed. They weren't trying to hide it. They weren't trying to deny it. They readily admitted that they had committed this sin and how it bothered them. So I did what I would normally do on that occasion. I assured them that God was faithful and just to forgive sins, and that if we recognize it as such, as sin, and if we believe in Him and we confess it, we can trust in Christ for our full and complete forgiveness. They then surprised me by saying, I know that God's forgiven me. That's not the problem here. The problem is that I've done this particular sin many times before, and I keep going back and doing it again. I keep doing what I know is wrong over and over again. So it became clear to me that the issue wasn't really about forgiveness. It was more about how can we stop making the same mistakes over and over again. What should we do in a case where we do something that we know is wrong? We might even know that it's harmful to ourselves or our relationships, yet we continue to do it over and over again. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever committed a sin? Well, of course, we all have. Let me rephrase that. Have you ever committed the same sin over and over again? Well, today I think this passage is helpful, because today we're going to begin to look at a man who made the same mistake twice over. And it probably is a helpful example and can teach us something if we're trapped in a situation where we keep going back to and repeating the same sins over and over again. And the person I'm talking about who did this, is none other than Abraham himself. So I hope you'll be able to continue with me and join with me over these next few days as we particularly look together at Genesis chapter 20. Today we're going to begin to look at this very much a next episode in the life of Abraham, and we'll do that by picking up the opening verses of chapter 20. And I'll just read verses 1 and 2 for you. It says this: Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, She is my sister. Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah, and he took her. So we're going to pause there right away, just for a minute. What's going on here is simply this. Abraham is committing exactly the same sin that was recorded back in Genesis chapter 12, when he first went down to Egypt. Do you remember that? And the problem there was knowing Pharaoh could potentially kill Abraham and take his attractive wife, as she's described. And Abraham said at that time, look, I've got an idea. When we get into Egypt, because this could happen, just say you're my sister. So he's committed this exact sin before, and now in this passage we are told he's about to start journeying into the southern part of Palestine. Now, there could have been all kinds of reasons that Abraham chose to do this. He was, after all, a herdsman. Maybe he needed more pasture for his flocks. He could have been moving towards a better place for trade, because we know that Abraham was also a bit of a businessman. And some have suggested that he just wanted to get as far away from the scene of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Whatever the reason is not exactly stated, but we see that he moves with his family into the Negev. And verse 2, he says again that Sarah, his wife, is his sister. That's what he tells the people who live in that area. But then Abimelech, by the way, Abimelech is not a personal name. It's a name which includes a title, sort of like Pharaoh, a king. But anyway, Abimelech hears about them, and the important point is that Abraham's lying about his wife again, because he doesn't want someone in such a high position of local governmental authority to take his wife and put her in his harem, and maybe even if potentially kill him in order that she would be free of marriage for him to do that. So for the second time, he lies about who his wife really is, and he says, she's my sister. Now, it's worth noting that the Bible specifically says that she was a very attractive-looking lady. Even as an older woman, she was still a very attractive lady. So Abraham is concerned about this again. And Abraham, of all people, at this point in his life, again strategizes about how he might save his own skin, but in a way that leaves the real possibility of his wife getting into serious trouble. So we looked at how that worked out the first time when it happened in chapter 12, when he tried that trick, and it did not work out well, friends. I wonder how it'll work out this time. Well, we'll find out together in the next episode. There's a lot to learn from this, isn't there? There's a lot to learn in these amazing ancient stories of the Bible. This narrative can really help us when it comes to our everyday lives. So let's do that together over these next few days. But anyway, today we're in this Genesis chapter 20, which we began yesterday with a bit of an introduction. And I'll just remind us of the opening two verses of Genesis chapter 1 and 2. But I've called today's study Breaking Harmful Patterns, because we're going to look at this repeated sin of Abraham. So verses 1 and 2, I'll just remind you, say this. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. Excuse me. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, she is my sister. Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah, and he took her. So as I said last time, we have seen Abraham make the same mistake as he made 8 chapters ago, as he made a while back. Now, I'd like to pause just to discuss this a little bit more, because it seems a little bit of a conflict for us, doesn't it, when we know and we hear about Abraham being recognized as one of the great men of faith in the Bible. And Abraham definitely is recognized in that way. The Bible makes it very clear in many places. In fact, even in the New Testament, he's described as an outstanding character, and one of the outstanding characters of faith from the Old Testament. He is actually given a place of particular prominence in the great, what is often called, the chapter that's called the roll call of faith, that you'll find in Hebrews chapter 9. The fact that he left his family and his hometown in his original call by God and goes out into the unknown is a testament to his faith. And he did that because he believed in God and the call that God had put upon his life. And that, of course, that in itself is a great illustration of faith, isn't it? Because he didn't really have any idea of where he was going to at that point or what faced him. And that's why in chapter 12, he makes this mistake, but yet he still reaches a point in chapter 15 where it says, Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him as righteousness. So he's been through all that and he's come to a place of faith. And Abraham generally was a man who, in the normal course of events, tried to practice what he believed. And his practice was to believe God. Let's be clear, he had moments where he slipped, but overall, he was a man of faith and a man of prayer. He'd just been through the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing, remember, at this point, and at that point, that narrative leaves us with probably the greatest illustration of how to wrestle in prayer with God, found throughout the whole Bible. It is a pattern for teaching us how to intercede with God into worldly situations. On that occasion, he interceded with God, initially to get God to delay destroying Sodom, and then also to save 10 faithful people who lived within that city. So Abraham was a man of faith, a great prayer warrior, a godly man, a great man of faith. Remember all the obstacles he had up to this point and all that he will have to face. And all of those things are seen to develop his faith. In fact, you could say that one of the key messages within the life of Abraham contained within this Genesis story of his life is how obstacles and challenges, how those things actually help develop his faith. So when we see Abraham here in chapter 20 lying again, this is an incredibly disappointing turn of events. Abraham was a man of faith, he had power and he prayed regularly, but yet he still manages to commit the same sin as he had previously committed. And that's really disappointing, isn't it? But you know what? It's also incredibly insightful. It's incredibly useful to know. The first time that he did this and lied about his wife Sarah, he tried to do it in secret, but Pharaoh discovered it and Pharaoh openly rebuked him for it. Now you will see in this passage that he does it again. But here we go. Newsflash, spoiler alert. A believer commits sins. Well, even patriarchs, great men of faith in the Old Testament, are seen to commit sin. But I want to explore this a bit because the fact that he, having been reached this point where he's been declared righteous, he still makes a mistake and repeats a sin that he's done in the past really bothers some people. The fact that he repeatedly sins is actually a puzzle to some people. One commentator I read said this, and I quote, "In many respects, Genesis 20 is one of the most difficult chapters in the Bible. To understand the narrative is simple enough, of course. But how could Abraham and Sarah at this time repeat the very same sin they committed years before? It might be understandable, but in the days when their faith had not been fully tested, or he hadn't seen God's faithfulness fully confirmed, that they should have fallen into such a trap over and over again seems absurd." That's interesting, isn't it? Maybe that's what you're thinking. Yes, it's true. He had reached this point where he had wonderful answers to prayers and many miraculous truths that God cared for him and that God protected him. And he has been seen to grow in his faith. I don't know if you've heard of F.B. Meyer. He was a very famous preacher and Bible commentator of a bygone age. And he entitled this study of this chapter, "A Bit of Old Flesh of the Old Nature." And he talked about how a sin not fully dealt with will often reappear. But you know what? The repetition of sins, the repeated falling in of sins, it shouldn't really surprise us. If we step back as Christian believers and understand the whole biblical doctrine, the whole position of the depravity of humankind, of who we are and on what basis we stand before a holy God, if we appreciate that, then we will understand that we are all capable of not only committing a sin, but repeating a sin over and over again. We all know that. And you know why we've all known that? I suspect we all know that's true because we've all done that at some point in our life, right? And that's exactly what Abraham does here. And what he does will produce some very serious problems for him again. And we shall look at how this unravels for him, begins to unravel for him and his family in the next episode. But today we're continuing this story of Abraham and Abimelech and the entanglement with Sarah and Abimelech, and we're going to pick up the text in Genesis 20 verse 8, which tells us this. Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials, and when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should never be done." And Abimelech asked Abraham, "What was your reason for doing this?" Abraham replied, "I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." So we see that Abimelech and the officials of the land are afraid of what has just occurred. So the question is, why are they afraid? Well, the answer is found in the verse when it said, God said, "If you do not restore her, then know that you shall surely die, and all who are yours also." So they were afraid that because of what had happened, Abimelech taking Sarah into his home to be his wife, that they were afraid that they were all going to die. So Abimelech, in this section, we see him call Abraham and says, "Why have you done this? Why have you put us at risk? How have I offended you," he actually asked, "that you brought onto me and my kingdom such a great sin?" What were you thinking of? What was going on in your head, we'd say in modern terms? Why did you do this to me? And Abraham said, "Because I felt sure that you or they would kill me on account of my wife." Now, Abraham has been challenged about why he did this, and his response is, "Well, you see, I didn't know you were God-fearing people around here, and I knew that my wife was beautiful, and I thought you as a powerful man, you'd just take her and kill me." In other words, Abraham very clearly again responded in fear. He didn't operate with faith, he acted out of fear. But then he adds in verse 12 this little caveat, and it's an important and insightful one. And he says, "Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not through my mother, and she has become my wife." So look closely. Abraham isn't exactly lying, is he, when he said he was his sister, which is sort of half true, because she was his half-sister. But this, friends, is a case when a half-truth is a whole lie. And there are many occasions, still today, when half-truths can equal complete lies. What he's doing here is simply trying to protect himself, but it's very clear the only person he's thinking about this, the only person he's concerned about is himself. He's not thinking about the repercussions on others. And then it adds, "And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, 'This is how you can show you love me. Everywhere we go, say, he is my brother.'" So do you pick up what's going on in that verse? On one verse, he's just saying, well, we had this arrangement right from the start, from when we first left Haran and set out. But look carefully. If you look carefully and read into the text, you can see at a level he's actually saying, this really isn't my fault. It was an agreement I made with my wife. And you, God, are the one who said Sarah was to be my wife and the mother of my offspring. Now, does that conversation, does the essence of that discussion sound familiar to you? Does it sound like you've heard it somewhere else, somewhere before? Well, I would say it sounds to me very like the conversation Adam had with the Lord in the garden when he said, "It's the woman that you gave me that led me astray. You gave her to me, God, so it's not my fault, it's her fault." And ultimately, he's really suggesting that it's God's fault in a way. That's what's really going on underneath these excuses. Now, we've got to be honest with ourselves and say we probably all have a tendency to blame God when things go wrong, or sometimes when we just even get into difficult situations. And ultimately, all temptation comes down to doubting the power of God and the goodness of God. And that's really what's going on in this passage. So picking up the text in verse 14, it tells us this. Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle, male and female, slaves, and gave them to Abraham. And he returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, the land is before you, live wherever you like. Wow, that's quite a response. Now you may remember what happened earlier in Abraham's life when he rescued Lot from the kings of the east. Remember, on that occasion he refused to accept the spoils of that victory, but now he accepts this as the man's offering, because he's accepting it as an offering out of fellowship as one who knows, or who has come to know, or who has heard from the Lord. Verse 16 then says, to Sarah he said, I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels, so this is Abimelech talking, of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you and are completely vindicated. So he makes that offer, even in the knowledge of knowing he never fulfilled the full married relationship. We know that God intervened and he was ill on the wedding night. So that's interesting, isn't it? He wants to cover up any potential offense that he has made. So what's going on here? Let's try and dig a little deeper and find out what's really happening in this very interesting and rather convoluted situation. But we'll begin to do that in the next episode. But we're picking up today in the story of Abraham and his wife Sarah, and this difficult situation that's arisen with Abimelech, where Abraham once again has pretended that Sarah is his sister, not his wife, and have called today's short little talk, God Will Always Protect His Promises. And I've drawn attention to the fact, really, that we arrive here today finding Abraham having done what he's done, which to me shows that he was capable of committing a sin and repeating it over and over again, well, just like you and I perhaps. But what he did before in lying about his wife and saying he was his sister way back in chapter 12, he's doing again here today in chapter 20. And this produces a really serious problem. And that problem is particularly brought to focus if we think about what God had promised to do with and through Abraham and his wife Sarah. So if God is in this situation, which of course he is, once again, he's going to need to intervene, and that's exactly what he does. And that's how we'll find out, and we'll pick up the story in verse 3, which tells us this. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman. Now Abimelech had not gone near her, so he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And didn't she also say, he is my brother? I have done this with a clear conscience and with clean hands. Excuse me. What happens at this point is God intervenes, and he intervenes by appearing in a dream to Abimelech. The point is, he's saying that Abimelech's response in that dream, he's saying, look, he has not come near her. And in other words, let's not beat about the bush. He's saying, I've not had sexual relationships with her yet. And he says, look, Lord, also, I didn't even know about this situation. As a matter of fact, he goes on in verse 5 to say, Abraham said to me that she was his sister, and even she said that he was his brother. Therefore, I am innocent of this charge. In other words, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know I was doing anything wrong, and I haven't even touched her yet. Now, in legal terms, he's saying I'm innocent because I didn't have prior knowledge. And surely you don't want to sentence me to death, to give me the death penalty for that, or the effects on my nation and family. So he's pleading ignorance. But that's worth considering at the moment and asking the question, is it true that you are innocent if you're ignorant? One example might be if you're driving down a road where the speed limit's 50 and you're doing 60 and a policeman pulls you over, can you say, I didn't know that was the speed limit? And the policeman say, that's fine, I'm not going to give you a ticket. You can't say that, I didn't know what the law was. The legal position in the UK law has always been ignorance of the law is not an excuse, but motive does come into it. So while what Abimelech is saying is true, it doesn't make any difference in relation to whether the law had been broken. If he had actually got round to sleeping with her, he would have then committed a sin. He would have broken the law of God at that point, even if he didn't know it. It's interesting, isn't it? Let's see what it says when the story continues in verse 6. Then God said to him in a dream, yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife to him, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you return to her, you may be sure that you and all who belong to you will die. So God says, look, Abimelech, it was I who prevented you from touching her. Now later in this passage, there are indications that Abimelech got sick that night. And as a matter of fact, it suggests that a whole bunch of people around him also got physically sick. So many Bible experts suggest, and I think rightly so, that God prevented the situation being carried further simply by making Abimelech unwell. Now, why did God get involved in all this? What was his motivation? Is he doing all of this to try and protect this one woman, Sarah's reputation? Now, I'm sure that's a factor in the background, but within the context of the book of Genesis, that's not the point that's being made here. God is not protecting one woman's reputation. God is protecting his promise. He had said, Abraham, you are going to have a son through this woman. And so in spite of everything, in spite of the nonsense we saw last time when he lied about her position as wife, in spite of the nonsense with the slave woman Hagar, God still says the promise I made was that you, Abraham, will have a son through Sarah, through which a nation will arise, through which the whole world will be blessed, and that promises that the benefits of that promise carry right down to you and to I today. So what he's doing, thanks be to God, he's protecting his promise, the promise he made him and the promise he has made you and I. And that's why he came and spoke to Abimelech in a dream. Well, we'll find out how everybody responds to this situation and how it all works out the next time we get together. No, excuse me, I'm going to just remind you and read the last verse that we finished with last time, just to remind you where we're up to, where we heard Abimelech speaking to Sarah, and he says this. To Sarah he said, I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offence against you and before all who are with you, so that they are completely vindicated. So Abimelech offers Sarah, Sarah's brother, Abraham, Sarah's brother, and of course wife, a gift, and that gift is of 1,000 shekels. Now, by giving such a large gift, he is vindicating before her and before everyone else to show that she was a guest and not part of his harem. He identifies her as the brother, but he didn't take her in marriage, and later found out, of course, that she was in fact, Sarah was married to Abraham. Now, the Hebrew word translated vindicates here actually means to cover the eyes. And I think that's a rather interesting turn of phrase that the writer chose to use. So this gift is going to cover the eyes of the people. In other words, it's going to cover up the aspects so that people, when they look, they don't think that Sarah has done anything wrong. Now, if you think that this is a bit of a strange story, well, if you think it's strange enough already, then perhaps you'll really struggle. You'll find it hard to believe what happens next. Then it tells us in verse 17, it says this, Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife, and his female slaves, so that they could have children again. For the Lord had kept all the women in Abimelech's household from conceiving because of Abraham's wife Sarah. So Abraham goes from being this fearful and inconsistent man who hid the truth from Abimelech at the beginning of the passage, and now at the end of the passage he's become this intercessor with God on behalf of the situation that in a sense he caused between the Lord and Abimelech, interceding with God that all things should be put back on a sure footing for Abimelech's household again. And we are told that God answers that prayer. As a result of it, God heals Abimelech's wife and his female servants, and they're all able to bear children again. That way, we saw that he prevented Abimelech and Sarah from having sexual relations. We know that was because he did that by making Abimelech and the household sick. But it seems now it's suggesting that the effect was on the whole of Abimelech's court and household. They all got sick and God now heals them, but it appears that what went wrong was that the whole household and the servants and the harem, as it would have been in those days, indicated some kind of sexual or fertility-based illness struck down the whole community. But the sum of this story is at its conclusion, and I think in spite of the difficulties in interpreting it in our modern mindset of exactly how things have worked out here, it's clear enough that Abraham again was seen to fail, and he practiced deception. But even in spite of that, in what went on here, God intervenes in a way to protect Sarah and in a sense protect Abimelech and his household, to preserve the purity, but also fundamentally to preserve the promise of God, the promise that God had made. Now, I want to close by making a couple of observations on this passage. And the number one today I want to just finish this talk about is by pointing out the fact that our individual failure will never be able to negate God's promises. It's worth probably writing that down or making a mental note of it. Even our repeated failure will never negate the promises of God. In other words, the sin of humanity does not prevent the promises of God from being fulfilled. Even our repeated failure will not nullify the promises of God. And in this dramatic situation, God saved Abraham because he had promised him he would have a son by Sarah, and he intervened to see that nothing would interfere with that promise. So even Abraham's repeated machinations and failure did not negate the promise that God had made to him. And this incident shows God's great faithfulness when compared to Abraham's fear and unfaithfulness. Abraham learned, or should have learned here, and we find out that he did in fact learn here, that the Lord would maintain his covenant and fulfill his promises in spite of outside opposition or interference, or even from internally from within the massive individual failings and sins of Abraham. This is the type of promise that God will not change. God, like the promise that God gives us of eternal life, in the sense that he promises us that no sin can never interfere with that promise. Even our repeated failure does not negate that promise. He gives us our salvation freely by trusting in his Son Jesus Christ. And our character is never going to be the grounds for acceptance before God. The blood of Christ, the atoning work of Christ, that's the promise of Scripture, which is applied by our faith, repentance and faith, is how we come to stand before God. And our individual successes or failures or otherwise, none of them can play any part in that. Now, having said that, I want to make it absolutely clear that does not mean that we are given a license to do what we want to do. And I need to add a second comment and a second caveat, that repeated failure will, of course, have consequences. But repeated failure does not negate the promises of God, but the failure themselves will have consequences for us. And providing we return to God confess them in repentance and faith in Jesus Christ, he is faithful to forgive. But there are potentially consequences when we do the wrong things and make the wrong choices. And we'll finish off this looking at chapter 20 when we look at those consequences of our failures in the final part of our examination of chapter 20 when we come back together again here next time. And we're closing out chapter 20 of Genesis, just trying to reach some conclusions about what this chapter might teach us. Here we are today, and if you remember last time, before we conclude this chapter, I said that I felt that we'd reached a conclusion where we had shown that our repeated failures in life will never devalue the promises of God. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that our failures will often have consequences, serious consequences. And it's those consequences that I want to look at today. Now, Hebrews chapter 12, for example, very clearly teaches at length that God sometimes will choose to discipline us for our actions. And one of the most surprising parts of this story is that even though that Abraham is seen to have failed repeatedly, catastrophically some might say, yet God still refers to him throughout the narrative of this story, right to the end, as a prophet. In this passage, Abraham's failure did not remove or erase the gifting that God had given him by declaring him to be a prophet. Now, when Abimelech learned the truth about Sarah being Abraham's wife, not just his sister, he must have thought Abraham was just a cowardly, hypocritical charlatan or worse. But then we see that God reveals himself to Abimelech in a dream and says in that dream, and I quote, "Return the man's wife to him, for he is a prophet, and then he will pray for you." So God is not seen to ignore Abraham's sin, but he will deal with that later with Abraham in his way. But Abraham's sin and his failures did not change God's view of him. He still called him a prophet. He still referred to him as a prophet, and he still referred to him in the lives of other people as a man chosen for a particular purpose. And it's also interesting to note that in all the references that are made to Abraham in the New Testament, never once do either of these two particular incidents appear. Nothing is there to highlight Abraham's failure, not in Romans, not in Galatians, not even in Hebrews chapter 11, that great roll call of faith in which Abraham is mentioned in some detail. Now, maybe that's why a lot of Christians today don't even know about this sin that occurred in Abraham's life, because maybe they don't read the Old Testament. They don't know that he made these mistakes. They don't even know that this particular sin occurred not just once, but twice. And this tells me that God remains gracious to everyone, even when it comes to their sin. He does not hold it against us if we come to him in faith and repentance. So I have one more observation to make on this chapter before I close, and it's just a particular truth here that I think is contained within it that I think is often missed or misunderstood. Now, I pointed out early in the series that Abraham was a man of faith, and that the life story recorded in Genesis was going to tell and show how his faith was tested over and over again. The events described here are the warts and all story of Abraham and the tests of his faith. But let's think about that for a minute. First Peter says that God tests our faith as if it were gold refined by fire. Now, this is what is often, I believe, misunderstood here. God often tests our faith and we go through hard times, but he does that in order to refine us. Take the imagery of refining gold that is used throughout the Bible, particularly in the New Testament. And there's a wonderful passage in the book of James that might be worth digging into if you've got the time. The image of refining gold doesn't change the gold. It just keeps removing the impurities. Refining is about having the dross removed and the other impurities taken away. What the fire does is it burns off the dross, which rises to the surface and is scooped off, leaving so that what is left is a purer and purer form of gold. Now, the whole point made throughout this chapter is that although Abraham is declared to be a man of faith, although he's declared to be a prophet of God, yet he disobeys God. And because of this, as he progresses through life, God gets to burn off the dross, leaving him better and more faithful and spiritually mature in the process. Which is why the New Testament writers use him as the great example of the life of faith. We will see later in the book of Genesis, he becomes a man who has really matured in his faith. But he didn't start out that way, friends. If you go back to when he was called by God to leave Ur of the Chaldees, he was called to leave his family, and he promptly left, yes, but he took his father and his brother with him. So in the beginning of his story, he had faith, but that faith was mixed with doubt. Sometimes it was mixed with disobedience, and on some occasions, even deception. And maybe that's how we all are when we begin our journey of faith as new believers. God let Abraham suffer the consequences of his actions in order to burn off those things so that what was left was pure. And I think that's what's going on in our lives when we're struggling or suffering. God is trying to burn out the dross until he brings us to a point where we can walk away from a situation, sometimes actually walking away from a situation of our own making, where we'll say, I never do that again, or even just the ability to recognize the small part that we played in bringing about a situation that may mainly be the responsibility of other people, but enables us to have the insight to identify the part that we played in our downfall, if you like. Now, it's really important to know that that means that we, at the end of this process, can end up more spiritually mature. But here's an important thing to bear in mind, which a lot of people don't really take account of. Remember, the account of things written in this book were written by Abraham himself. So why did Abraham record such a negative view of himself throughout this book? The lesson is, he is a man who trusts in God and is refined and blessed by doing it. He's saying, look at me. I lied, he said. I deceived people, but I want you to know that I learned from this. And what I learned to do was trust the Lord. So Abraham is saying, by reading this, learn from my mistakes. Don't try and deceive people, and don't ever try and deceive the Lord. I think that's what Abraham learned through his life, and I think it's what we all can learn when we're going through the fire. God will use the difficult times in life to burn off the dross so that our faith can grow stronger and we can reach a greater level of spiritual maturity. And thanks be to God for that. Okay, that's it for today. We've concluded chapter 20, and we'll launch off again tomorrow when we look at chapter 21.